The PDH Pod podcast is a great source of PDH news, tips, and tricks, so don't forget to check it out. It is available on this channel and almost anywhere you find podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe for more PDH content, and like this video. It really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm and doesn't cost you anything. Now let's get started. Robert is going first with Scarland Thrinax, a 2/2 lizard for a black, red, and green. It has sacrifice a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on Scarland Thrinax. Wales is going second with Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator, a legendary 2/2 Siren Pirate for 2 and a blue with flying, and whenever one or more pirates you control deal damage to your opponents, you create a treasure token for each opponent dealt damage. And partner with the chosen partner of Breeches, Brazen Plunderer, a legendary 3/3 Goblin Pirate for 3 and a red. It has menace, and whenever one or more pirates you control deal damage to your opponents, exile the top card of those opponents' libraries. You may play those cards this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. And partner, Brad Drakv is going third with Bear's Companion, a 2/2 human warrior for 2, a green, a blue, and a red, with when Bear's Companion enters the battlefield, create a 4/4 green bear creature token. And going last is Derek with Sarinth Steelseeker, a 1/2 human artificer scout with whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. If you don't put the card into your hand, you may put it into your graveyard. Derek takes a mulligan and keeps his second 7. All other players keep their starting 7. Robert starts the game with a snow-covered swamp into a sanitarium skeleton, a 1/2 that you can pay 2 and a black to return from your graveyard to your hand. Wales plays an island and passes. Brad plays a forest and casts Arboreal Grazer, a 0/3 with reach that allows you to put a land into play tapped when it enters. Brad puts a mountain into play and passes. Derek plays Opal Palace and ends his turn. Robert untaps, plays a snow-covered forest, attacks Wales for 1, and passes. Wales plays a mountain and Talus Scout, a 1/2 with flying. Brad starts his turn, casts Rampant Growth, and puts a basic island into play tapped from his deck. Derek plays a forest and a Llanowar Scout, a 1/3 that can be tapped to put a land from your hand into play. He passes. Robert plays Snow-Covered Mountain and passes. Wales plays an island and taps out for Rishadan Cutpurse, a 1/1. When it enters, each opponent sacrifices a permanent unless they pay 1. Brad sacrifices Arboreal Grazer, Derek sacrifices a forest, and Robert pays 1. Wales attacks Brad for 1 and passes. On his turn, Brad casts Cultivate, which puts an island into play tapped and a forest into his hand from his deck. He plays the forest and uses it to play Fyndhorn Elves. Derek untaps for turn, plays a forest, and casts his commander, Sarinth Steelseeker, and passes. On his end step, Robert casts Village Rites, sacrificing Sanitarium Skeleton as an additional cost. He draws 2 cards, and then starts his turn. He puts a snow-covered swamp into play and casts Innocent Blood, which makes each player sacrifice a creature. Derek responds by tapping Llanowar Scout to put a forest into play. Wales sacrifices Rishadan Cutpurse, Brad sacrifices Fyndhorn Elves, and Derek sacrifices Llanowar Scout. Next, Robert casts Underworld Ragehound, a 3/1 that attacks each turn if able, that has escape for 3, a red, and 3 cards. When it's escaped, it enters with a +1/+1 counter. And finally, he plays a Blister Pod, a 1/1 that creates a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion token that can be sacrificed for a colorless mana. Wales begins his turn, plays an island, and plays one of his commanders, Breeches. He attacks Robert for 1 with flying. Robert takes 1, which triggers Breeches. Robert exiles a mountain, and Wales ends his turn. Brad casts Candlekeep Sage, a legendary enchantment that gives his commander, when this creature enters or leaves the battlefield, draw a card. He then passes. In his end step, Derek casts Goblin Firebomb, an artifact that has flash that you can pay 7, tap, and sacrifice to destroy a permanent. Sarinth triggers, so he looks at the top card of his deck. He chooses to keep it on top and then starts his turn. He plays a forest and a Pilgrim's Eye, a 1/1 that when it enters, puts a basic land from his deck into his hand. His commander also triggers. He looks at the top card of his deck first, choosing to keep it on top, and then puts a forest into his hand from his deck. Robert plays his commander, Scarland Thrinax, and goes to combat. He attacks Wales with his 3/1 and Brad with his 1/1. Neither player blocks, and Robert passes. Wales untaps, plays an island, and casts his other commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He follows that up by enchanting it with Swashbuckling, which gives it +2/+2 in haste. As Wales enters combat, Brad targets the Swashbuckling with Return to Nature, destroying it. Wales attacks Brad for 1 with flying, and Robert for 3 with menace. Robert sacrifices Blister Pod to Scarland Thrinax to put a +1/+1 counter on it. The Blister Pod makes a 1/1 Eldrazi Scion that Robert uses along with Thrinax to block Breeches. Before damage, he also sacrifices the Scion to make the Thrinax a 4/4. Breeches dies, and Brad takes 1. Malcolm and Breeches trigger, so Wales gets a treasure, and Brad exiles Seagate Oracle from the top of his deck. Wales passes. Brad casts Skyshroud Claim, which puts 2 forests from Brad's deck into play. He puts Tangled Islet and a basic forest into play and passes. Derek plays a forest and Swiftgear Drake, a 2/4 with flying, haste, that puts a target card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library when it enters. He uses it to get rid of Lobert's Sanitarium Skeleton. His commander triggers, which reveals a study hall, so he puts it into his hand and then passes. Lobert plays a Brindleshote, a 1/1 that makes a 3/3 when it dies. He attacks Derek with his 4/4 commander and Brad with his 3/1. Derek chump blocks with Pilgrim's Eye, and Brad takes 3. Wales starts his turn and plays Breeches again. He attacks Lobert for 2 and Brad for 1. They both take it, so Wales' commanders both trigger twice. Lobert exiles a snow-covered swamp, Brad exiles an Impulsive Pilferer, and Wales gets 2 treasures. He uses a treasure to play Impulsive Pilferer, a 1/1 that creates a treasure when it dies and has Encore for 3 and a red. He passes. Brad plays his commander, so he gets a 4/4 bear token and draws a card off of Candlekeep Sage. Derek begins his turn and casts Mere Retriever, a 1/1 that puts a target artifact from his graveyard into his hand when it dies. His commander triggers, and he chooses to leave the card on top of his deck. Next, he plays Scale the Heights, which puts a +1/+1 counter on Swiftgear Drake, gains him 2 life, allows him to play an additional land this turn, and draws him a card. He passes. Lobert plays a tapped Cliffgate, names green, and goes to combat. He attacks Derek with his 4/4 commander and Wales with his 3/1. Wales trades the Impulsive Pilferer for the Underworld Ragehound, and Derek chump blocks with Mere Retriever. Wales gets a treasure from Impulsive Pilferer dying, and Derek returns Pilgrim's Eye from his graveyard to his hand. After combat, Lobert pays Underworld Ragehound's escape cost to replay it. It enters with a +1/+1 counter from its ability. Lobert passes. Wales starts his turn and goes straight to combat. He attacks Lobert with his 2/2 commander and Brad for 1. Brad casts Moment's Peace, which prevents all combat damage this turn. It has flashback for 2 and a green. After combat, Wales plays Talus Airship, a 3/2 with flying. Brad begins his turn and casts Behold the Multiverse, which lets him scry 2 and draw 2. He puts 1 card on top and the other on bottom. He plays Study Hall as his land for turn and casts Augury Owl, which lets him scry 3 when it enters the battlefield. He puts 1 card on top and 2 on the bottom. Brad passes. Derek casts Iker Wellspring, an artifact that draws a card when it enters or goes from the battlefield to the graveyard. His commander triggers. He leaves the card on top and then draws it. Next, he plays Pilgrim's Eye again. He gets a forest off of his creature's ability, and then resolves his commander's trigger. He reveals a Darksteel Citadel, which he plays. That triggers his commander a 3rd time. He chooses to leave the card on top, and then casts Mere Enforcer, a 4/4 with affinity for artifacts. Lobert untaps, draws for turn, and plays Thriving Bluff. Naming black, he targets Derek's Swiftgear Drake to destroy it with Cast Down. He attacks Wales with the 4/4 Scarland Thrinax, and Derek with the 4/2 Underworld Ragehound. Wales does not block, and Derek chump blocks with his commander. Lobert passes. In his end step, Wales plays Opt to scry 1 and draw a card. He keeps the card on top. He starts his turn and plays Amorphous Axe, an equipment that gives the equipped creature +3/+0 and every creature type. It equips for 3. He goes to combat, attacks Lobert for 2 with Malcolm, Derek with the 3/2 with flying, and Brad with the 1/2 with flying. Brad blocks with Augury Owl, and Derek blocks with Pilgrim's Eye. Brad flickers Augury Owl and Bear's Companion with Displace, so he gets another 4/4 bear, draws 2 cards off of Candlekeep Sage, and he gets to scry 3. Damage happens, so Derek's Pilgrim's Eye dies, and Lobert takes 2 commander damage. Wales' commander's triggers, so he makes a treasure, and Lobert exiles Abundant Growth. Wales uses a treasure to play the Abundant Growth on an island. Abundant Growth allows the land to tap for any color, and draws a card when it enters. Wales then plays Azure Fleet Admiral, a 3/3 that makes him the Monarch when it enters. He passes the turn, and draws for Monarch. Brad casts Rush of Knowledge, which draws him a number of cards equal to the highest converted mana value permanent he controls, 5. He plays a forest, and then enchants his Augury Owl with Security Bypass, which gives it unblockable, and it connives each time it deals damage to a player. He then attacks Wales with the Owl for 1. Wales takes it, so Brad connives. He discards Explorer, so the Owl gets a +1/+1 counter. He becomes the Monarch, and passes, drawing off of the Monarch. Derek plays a forest, followed by his commander. He filtered mana through Opal Palace and Study Hall, so the creature enters with 2 +1/+1 counters, and he gets to scry 2. He leaves both cards on top and then passes. Lobert plays Wrought Tide Gargantua, a 5/4, and sacrifices Brindleshote to exploit it, so he gets a 3/3 from Brindleshote dying, and each of his opponents have to sacrifice a creature. Wales sacrifices Azure Fleet Admiral, Brad sacrifices a bear token, and Derek sacrifices Mere Enforcer. He attacks Brad with a 4/4 Scarland Thrinax and Wales with a 4/2 Underworld Ragehound. Brad targets the Thrinax and Breeches with Run Away together, return them to their owner's hands. Lobert responds with Snakeskin Veil to give the Thrinax a +1/+1 counter and hexproof until end of turn. Wales takes 4 and Brad takes 5, so Lobert becomes the Monarch. Lobert passes and draws off of the Monarch. Wales pays 4 to redeploy Breeches, and then goes to combat. He attacks Lobert with his 2/2 Commander, Brad with a 1/2, and Derek with a 3/2, all with flying. Derek targets his own commander with Evolution Charm, with the chosen mode of giving a creature flying until end of turn, and blocks the 3/2, so it dies, and the other players take their combat damage. Wales becomes the Monarch, and his commander triggers, so he gets 2 treasures. Lobert exiles a mountain, and Brad exiles a Hexbane Tortoise. Wales plays Lobert's Mountain, and casts the Tortoise, a 3/2 with ward for 2 mana and Enlist. He passes, and draws off of Monarch. Brad uses Ghostly Flicker to flicker his commander, an Augury Owl, so he draws 2 cards off of Candlekeep Sage, gets a 4/4 bear token, and he gets to scry 3. Next, casts Llanowar Visionary, a 2/2 that draws a card when it enters and taps for a green. Brad passes. Derek untaps and plays Tower Worker, a 1/3 with reach that taps for a colorless. If he controls a mine and a power plant worker, taps for an additional 2. His commander triggers, and Derek leaves the card on top. Next, he plays a Foundry Inspector, a 3/2 that reduces the cost of his artifact spells by 1. He passes. Lobert enchants Scarland Thrinax with Rancor to give it +2/+0 and trample. Rancor returns to his hand if it is sent to the graveyard. He then plays Fleshbag Marauder, a 3/1 that makes each player sacrifice a creature when it enters. Brad counters it with Counterspell. Lobert goes to combat, attacks Wales with a 3/3 token, Brad with the 4/2 Ragehound, and Derek with his 7/5 commander with Trample. Wales blocks with the Tortoise, Brad blocks with his commander, and Derek stack blocks with his 3/4 commander and 3/2 Foundry Inspector. Lobert sacrifices his token and Ragehound to make the Thrinax a 9/7. Both of Derek's creatures die, and he takes 3. Lobert passes. Wales plays Hijack, targeting Scarland Thrinax to untap it, and gain control of it until end of turn. Lobert and Wales make a deal that he won't attack Lobert with it if he doesn't sacrifice it in response. Next, he casts Boarding Party, a 6/3 with haste and cascade. He cascades into Sailor of Means, a 1/4 that creates a treasure when it enters. Wales attacks Lobert with his 2/2 commander, with flying, and a 6/3. He also attacks Derek with a 9/7 Thrinax, 3/3 Breeches with Menace, and Hexbane Tortoise. Lobert deals 3 damage to Malcolm with Lightning Bolt, and blocks the 6/3 with his 5/4, so they trade, and Derek takes 16. Breeches triggers from the damage, so Derek exiles Introduction to Prophecy. After combat, he sacrifices Thrinax to itself. Rancor returns to Lobert's hand, and then Wales passes. He draws a card off of being Monarch. Brad plays an island and targets Bear's Companion with Blur, which flickers it and draws him a card. He draws an additional 2 cards off of Candlekeep Sage, and makes another 4/4 Bear token. He plays a Chromatic Star, an artifact that allows you to filter a mana, and draws a card when it goes to the graveyard. He then targets Bear's Companion with Teferi's Time Twist, which exiles it until the start of the next end step, when it returns with a +1/+1 counter on it. He draws another card from Candlekeep Sage, from his commander leaving play, and then targets Breeches with Flame Slash to deal 4 damage to it. Brad then attacks Lobert for 4 with a bear. He moves to his end step and his commander comes back with a counter. He gets another bear token, and draws off of Candlekeep Sage. Derek starts his turn and pays 6 for his commander, filtering a mana through Opal Palace and Study Hall so it enters with 3 +1/+1 counters, and he gets to scry 3. He leaves 2 cards on top, and puts 1 on the bottom. Next, he plays his own Chromatic Star. His commander triggers, and he reveals a forest, so he puts it into his hand and passes. Lobert casts First Sphere Gargantua, a 5/4 that draws him a card and loses him a life when it enters the battlefield, and has Unearth for 2 and a black. He plays Gruul Turf, which returns a snow-covered mountain to his hand, and he ends his turn. Wales pays 5 for Malcolm and attacks Lobert for 1 with flying. Wales gets a treasure, and then casts Amoeboid Changeling, a 1/1 with all creature types, and the ability to tap and give a target creature all creature types, or remove a target creature's creature types until end of turn. He passes, draws off of the Monarch, and discards a mountain to hand size. Brad plays a mountain, taps it to filter a mana into green using Chromatic Star, and draws a card. He then plays Rust Goliath for 10, a 10/10 with reach and trample. He attacks Lobert with his 1/1 with flying, and Wales with a 4/4 bear. Wales blocks with a 3/2 Hexbane Tortoise and 1/4 Sailor of Means. Lobert takes 1, and Brad chooses to kill the tortoise, and passes. Derek plays a forest and casts his own 10/10 Rust Goliath. His commander triggers and puts a forest into his hand. He passes. Lobert plays a snow-covered forest and pays 5 to cast his commander again before passing. Wheels casts an Erasca Relic, an artifact that taps for a colorless, or if he has 10 or more permanents, it can tap and sacrifice itself for 3 life and a card. He attacks Lobbert for 1, makes a treasure, casts Impulsive Pilferer, and equips Amorphous Axe to it to make it a 4/1 with all creature types. He passes and draws off of Monarch. Brad casts Migratory Greathorn, a 3/4 with Mutate that allows him to put a basic land from his deck into play when it mutates. Brad attacks Wales with his 3/3 Commander and 10/10 with Trample. Wales sacrifices Erasca Relic to gain 3 life and draw a card. Wales then targets Sailor of Means with Siren's Ruse, which flickers it and draws him a card because it's a pirate. He gets a treasure from Sailor of Means entering the battlefield, blocks Bear's Companion with it, and takes 10. Brad becomes the Monarch. After combat, Brad plays Sakura Tribe Elder, a 1/1 that he can sacrifice to put a basic land from his deck into play tapped, and passes, drawing off of the Monarch. Derek filters mana into Chromatic Star to draw a card, plays a forest, and uses the floating green in a forest to play Gaia's Touch, an enchantment that allows him to put a basic forest into play from his hand once per turn. It can also be sacrificed for 2 green. He plays an additional land and passes. Lobbert enchants First Sphere Gargantua with Rancor, make it a 7/4 with Trample, and plays a Golgari Rot Farm, which returns a forest to his hand. Lobbert passes. Wales goes straight to combat and attacks Lobbert with Malcolm for 2, bringing him up to 8 commander damage. Wales makes a treasure and casts Swaggering Corsair, a 2/2 that enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter because he attacked this turn. Next, he plays Kitesail Corsair, a 2/1 with flying as long as it's attacking. He follows that up with a Goblin Trailblazer, a 2/1 with menace, and then ends his turn. Brad casts Simic Signet and goes to combat, attacking Lobbert with his 3/3 Bear's Companion. Lobbert blocks with his 7/4, Bear's Companion dies, so Brad draws a card off of Candlekeep Sage. After combat, Brad plays a forest and pays 7 to recast Bear's Companion again, filtering a mana through Study Hall so he gets to scry 2. He leaves both cards on top. It enters the battlefield, so he draws a card and creates a 4/4 bear token. He passes and draws off of Monarch. At the end of his turn, Derek pays 7 and sacrifices Goblin Firebomb to destroy Brad's Rust Goliath. Brad responds to that by destroying Derek's Rust Goliath with the artifact destruction mode of a Braid. Derek begins his turn and casts Springleaf Drum. His commander puts a Crystal Grotto into his hand, which he plays immediately and uses to cast Staunch Throne Guard, a 2/5 with Vigilance that gives him the Monarch. His commander triggers, he leaves the card on top, and then draws it off of the Monarch when he passes the turn. Lobbert plays a Snow-Covered Forest and pays Underworld Ragehound's Escape cost again. Next, he plays Nested Shambler, a 1/1 that creates a number of squirrel tokens equal to its power when it dies. He attacks Brad with his 7/4 with Trample. Brad chump blocks with his commander. He takes 5 and draws a card off of Candlekeep Sage. Wales starts his turn and casts Fiery Cannonade, which deals 2 damage to each non-pirate creature. Brad responds by casting Tamio's Safekeeping on Augury Owl to gain 2 life, give it hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. Lobbert sacrifices his Nested Shambler, the squirrel token it makes, and Underworld Ragehound to Scarland Thrinax to make it a 5/5. The Cannonade resolves, which kills Brad's Llanowar Visionary. Wales goes to combat, attacking Lobbert with Malcolm. Lobbert goes up to 10 commander damage, and Wales makes a treasure. After combat, he plays Stormfleet Pyromancer, which deals 2 damage to one of Brad's bear tokens because he attacked this turn. The bear dies. Wales passes. Brad begins his turn, plays a forest, and pays 9 for his commander, filtering a mana through Study Hall to scry 3. He puts 2 on top and 1 on the bottom, draws off of Candlekeep Sage, and gets a 4/4 bear token. Next, he plays Moldrifter, a 2/2 with flying that draws him 2 cards when it enters. He enchants it with Rancor to make it a 4/2 and passes. Derek casts Coastal Bulwark, a 1/3 with Defender that gets +2/+0 if he controls an island, and has an activated ability of 2 and tap to surveil 1. His commander triggers, and he puts a forest into his hand, plays the forest, and casts Mine Worker, a 2/1 that taps to gain you a life. If you control a power plant and tower worker, it gains 2 additional life. His commander triggers, and Derek keeps the card on top. He passes, and draws off of the Monarch. Lobbert plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and casts You Meet in a Tavern, choosing to form a party, which lets him look at the top 5 cards of his deck, put any number of creatures from among them into his hand, and put the rest on the bottom of his deck. He reveals Impulsive Pilferer and Abyssal Gatekeeper. He plays the Pilferer, and then the Abyssal Gatekeeper. The Gatekeeper is a 1/1 that makes each player sacrifice a creature when it dies. He sacrifices the Gatekeeper to Scarland Thrinax, so each player sacrifices a creature. Lobbert sacrifices Impulsive Pilferer, Wales sacrifices Goblin Trailblazer, Brad sacrifices Migratory Greathorn, and Derek sacrifices his commander. Lobbert gets a treasure from the Pilferer dying, and then pays 4 to pay the Pilferer's Encore cost, so he gets 3 token copies of it. Lobbert attacks each player with a token, and Brad with Scarland Thrinax. Each player blocks the token attacking them. Red blocks the Thrinax with Bear's Companion and targets it with Planar Incision to flicker it and give it a +1/+1 counter. He draws 2 off of Candlekeep Sage and makes a 4/4 Bear token. Lobert sacrifices his 3 tokens to Scarland Thrinax, so he gets 3 treasure tokens. He uses 2 of the treasures to play Teamer Battle Rage on his 9/9 Thrinax, giving it double strike and trample until end of turn. Brad takes 18 commander damage and is eliminated. Lobert passes. Whales cycles a Forgotten Cave, pays 8 for Breeches, and goes to combat. He attacks Lobert with his 2/2 commander, a 2/1, and a 1/2, all with flying, and the 4/1 Impulsive Pilferer. Lobert blocks the 4/1 with his 7/4 and targets it with Supernatural Stamina, which gives it +2/+0 and returns it to the battlefield tapped when it dies. Lobert takes 5 damage, gets Rancor back, and loses an additional 1 to draw a card off of First Sphere Gargantua's ability. Wheels passes. Derek casts his commander for 8, filtering a mana through Opal Palace and Study Hall, so it enters with 4 counters, and he gets to scry 4. He puts 2 on top and 2 on bottom. Next, he plays Tangle Golem, a 5/4 with affinity for forests, and then casts Filigree Familiar, a 2/2 that gains him 2 life when it enters, and draws a card when it dies, and draws a card off of Monarch. Lobert enchants his commander with Rancor, and Wales responds by countering it with Cancel. Lobert plays Liliana's Spectre, a 2/1 with flying that makes his opponents discard a card. Wales discards Talus Explorer, and Derek discards Fangren Marauder. Lobert goes to combat and attacks Wales with his 9/9 commander. Wales chumps with Amoeboid Changeling and passes. Wales attacks Derek with his 2/2 Malcolm and 1/2. Both have flying. He also attacks Lobert with a 2/1 with flying. Lobert pays 4 mana for Snuff Out to destroy it. Derek blocks Malcolm with his 1/3 with Reach and takes 1. Wales becomes the Monarch, makes a treasure, and Derek exiles a Skyscanner to Breeches. Wales casts the Skyscanner, which is a 1/1 with flying that draws a card when it enters. He plays an island, casts Burdened Aerialist, a 3/1 that creates a treasure token when it enters, and gets flying until end of turn when he sacrifices a token. He used Path of Ancestry to play it, so he gets to scry 1. He puts the card on bottom. He equips Amorphous Axe to Skyscanner and passes, drawing a card off of the Monarch. On his end step, Derek gains a life using Mineworker. In his upkeep, Derek uses Coastal Bulwark to surveil 1, putting Glittermonger into his graveyard. Next, he plays Expedition Map, an artifact that he can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice to put a land from his deck into his hand. His commander triggers, and he puts the card into his graveyard. It's a Scaled Herbalist. He sacrifices the map to put Takacia's Dig Site into his hand. He plays it as his land for turn and passes. Lobert goes straight to combat and attacks Wales with his 6/4, and Derek with his 9/9 commander. Wales blocks with his 4/1 Skyscanner, and Derek blocks with Filigree Familiar. Lobert 6/4, Wales 4/1, and Derek's Familiar die. Derek draws a card off of the Familiar's death trigger. After combat, Lobert plays Underworld Ragehound's escape cost, and then passes. Wales plays Siren Lookout, a 1/2 with flying that explores when it enters. Wales reveals Brazen Buccaneers, so it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. He chooses to keep it on top of his deck. He goes to combat and attacks Lobert with a 2/2 Malcolm, and Derek with a 3/1, and a 1/2 with flying. He sacrifices a treasure to give his 3/1 flying until end of turn. Damage happens, so Malcolm and Breeches trigger. Wales gets a treasure, and Derek exiles Fierce Empath. Next, he plays Rashadan Airship, a 3/1 with flying that can only block creatures with flying. He equips his axe to Siren Lookout to make it a 5/3 and passes. Derek plays Ancient Stirrings, which allows him to look at the top 5 cards of his deck and put a colorless card into his hand. He reveals Seer's Lantern, casts the lantern. It's an artifact that can be tapped for a colorless mana, or he can pay 2 and tap it to scry 1. His commander triggers and puts a forest into his hand, which he plays, and then casts Stone Retrieval Unit, a 2/3 that creates a Power Stone when it enters. His commander triggers 2 more times. He puts Maelstrom Colossus and Sylvanas' Invoker into his graveyard, and then attacks Wales with his 5/6 commander. Wales stack blocks with a 3/3 and a 3/2. Those 3 creatures die, and Derek passes. Lobert plays a Thriving Grove as his land for turn, names Black, and goes to combat. He attacks Wales with his 4/2. Wales chump blocks with his 1/4. Lobert passes. Wales casts Brazen Buccaneers, a 2/2 with haste that explores when it enters. He used Path of Ancestry, so he gets to scry 1. He leaves the card on top and reveals Buccaneer's Bravado, an instant that can give a pirate +1/+1 and double strike until end of turn. He sacrifices a treasure to give Burdened Aerialist flying until end of turn, and attacks Derek with a 5/3, 3/2, 1/2, and 3/1, all with flying, and attacks Lobert with a 3/3 Breeches with Menace. Derek blocks the 3/1 with his 1/3 with Reach, and takes 9. Lobert takes 3. Derek surveils using Coastal Bulwark, puts Wildheart Invoker into his graveyard, and then scries 1 with Seer's Lantern, leaving the card on top. Wales gets 2 treasures. Derek exiles Explorer, and Lobert exiles Rakdos Carnarium. After combat, Wales plays Lobert's Rakdos Carnarium, which returns an island to his hand. Next, Wales plays Deadeye Rig Hauler, a 3/2 that returns Scarland Thrinax to Lobert's hand because he attacked with a creature this turn. On his end step, he draws a card for Monarch, and Derek gains a life off of Mineworker. In Derek's upkeep, he activates Takacia's Dig Site to surveil one. He puts Tree of Tales into his graveyard, and then uses Seer's Lantern to scry one. He puts the card on bottom and draws for turn. He plays Haunted Fengraf as his land for turn, which he sacrifices to return a random creature from his graveyard to his hand. Scaled Herbalist goes to his hand, and he casts it. It's a 1/3 that he can tap to put a land into play. He goes to combat and attacks Wales with a 2/5 with Vigilance, 5/4, and 2/3. Wales blocks the 2/3 with a 3/3, and the 5/4 with a 3/2. He uses Buccaneer's Bravado to give his 3/2 +1/+1 and double strike until end of turn. Takes 2. Derek's 5/4 and 2/3 die, and he becomes the Monarch. He passes and draws for Monarch. Lobert plays Scarland Thrinax, and then plays Sylvok Lifestaff, an equipment that gives the equipped creature +1/+0 and gains 3 life when the equipped creature dies. It equips for 1. He equips it to Underworld Ragehound and attacks Derek with the 5/2. Derek blocks with the 2/1 Mineworker and taps it to gain a life. Lobert sacrifices the Ragehound to put a counter on the Thrinax. Lobert gains 3 life. After combat, he pays the Ragehound's escape cost and equips the Life Staff to it again before passing. Wales pays 7 for Malcolm and goes to combat. He attacks Lobert with a 5/3 with flying, and Derek with a 1/2 and 3/1, both with flying. Lobert sacrifices Underworld Ragehound to Scarland Thrinax to put a +1/+1 counter on it and gain 3 life off of the Life Staff. Derek takes 4, putting him to 1, and Lobert takes 5, putting him to 3. Wales becomes the Monarch. After combat, he plays Traveler's Amulet, an artifact that he can pay 1 and sacrifice to put a basic land from his deck into his hand. He sacrifices it immediately for an island. On his end step, he draws for Monarch, and Derek uses Coastal Bulwark to surveil Ceruli Caretaker into his graveyard. He starts his turn and uses Seer's Lantern, puts the card on bottom, and activates Takacia's Dig Site to put Nimblewright Schematic into his graveyard. He draws for turn, and plays his commander for 10, filtering mana through Study Hall and Opal Palace, so it enters with 5 +1/+1 counters, and he gets to scry 5. He uses Springleaf Drum and Scaled Herbalist to play Prize Fight, targeting his commander and Siren's Lookout. The creatures fight, and Derek makes a treasure, so Siren Lookout dies. Derek plays Sojourner's Companion, a 4/4 with affinity for artifacts and artifact land cycling. His commander triggers and puts a forest into his hand, which he plays and then passes. Lobert pays Underworld Ragehound's escape cost again, equips Lifestaff to it, and enchants it with Bequeathal, an enchantment that draws 2 cards when the enchanted creature dies. Lobert sacrifices the Ragehound to Scarland Thrinax to gain 3 life and draw 2 cards. He brings back the Ragehound again, plays Tuckatung Thallid, a 1/1 that makes a 1/1 Saproling token when it dies, equips the Thallid, sacrifices it to gain another 3 life, and make a Saproling token. Equips the token, sacrifices it for another 3 life, and then uses his treasure to equip Underworld Ragehound. He attacks Wales with his 5/5 commander, Wales chump blocks with a 3/3, and Lobert passes. Wales plays an island and casts Cloud Pirates, a 1/1 with flying that can only block creatures with flying. He follows that up with Makeshift Munitions, an enchantment that he can pay 1 and sacrifice an artifact or creature, deal 1 damage to anything. He goes to combat and attacks Lobert with 6 power in the air, a 3/3 menace, and a 3/2. Lobert blocks the 3/2 with his Ragehound, and Wales is able to ping Lobert out of the game. Wales wins. Thank you for watching until the end. Please don't forget to check out the PDH Pod podcast, like, and subscribe.